Good morning and welcome to the latest installment of SIO's Educational Webinar Series on natural products and the impact of COVID-19. Today's webinar is being offered in two parts by two dynamic presenters. There will be a 5-minute Q&A following each segment of today's presentation. Please submit your questions through the Q&A feature, and the doctors will address them immediately following their presentations. There will also be an opportunity to provide feedback at the end of today's webinar. Please make sure to respond to ensure future high-quality programming. We're going to start with part 1 today, Evidence for Preventing and Treating COVID-19 with Natural Supplements. This is presented by Tara Berman, MD, MS. Dr. Berman is an oncologist for the breast GYN malignancies team in the Office of Oncologic Diseases at Center for Drug Evaluation and Research in the Food and Drug Administration, where she serves as the Integrative Oncology Liaison for the division. Dr. Berman received her medical degree from the Sackler School of Medicine in Tel Aviv and Master of Science in Nutrition from Columbia University. She completed her oncology fellowship at the National Cancer Institute. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Tara Berman.
Thank you, Maureen, and thank you everyone for tuning in today. I'm excited to talk to you about the evidence for preventing and treating COVID-19 with natural product supplements. The objective of my talk is to share the data behind these commonly used supplements in combating COVID-19. I'll give a brief background about viral structure and viral entry points, and then this will be followed by the evidence for supplement use in COVID-19 treatment and prevention, including vitamins D, C, quercetin, and zinc, and then I'll conclude with a question and answer session. In December 2019, the SARS coronavirus 2 was discovered and sequenced. This is the virus that causes the disease COVID-19. Understanding the virus structure and how it affects our cells is integral in learning how to treat and prevent COVID-19. As you can see here, the virus is a sphere with protruding spikes. These spike proteins interact with a protein on our cells called ACE2 to enter and infect the cell. The coronavirus also uses an enzyme in our body called furin to help infect our cells, which is highly concentrated in the lungs. And there are certain adverse effects of COVID-19 that can be very severe and sometimes fatal. One of these is called cytokine storm, and the other is acute respiratory distress syndrome, and ARDS. In cytokine storm, the lining of the lungs and other organs are damaged, and this can lead to death. This is a sequela of overactivity of the immune system, as is ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome. This is the result of an acute systemic inflammatory response, which can be caused by insults directly to the lung or indirectly to the lung. As of today, there are no FDA-approved treatments specifically for COVID-19. However, the NIH provides information about available therapies for emergency use and other treatment and prevention options. And of note, they recently updated their guidelines to include information on vitamins C, D, and zinc, which I will review today. I alluded to this earlier, but a particular study, it's important to understand how the virus enters and replicates in our cells in order to develop specific drug targets to fight this infection. This particular study built a computational model around the interaction of the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein with our human ACE2 receptor. The researchers used human furin and ACE2 genes as baits to build gene maps and tried to identify small molecules that could bind the spike protein or the ACE2 receptor to disrupt viral entries into cells. The researchers of the study detected 2 promising small molecule candidates that could interact highly in the viral entry replication pathway. And these 2 molecules happen to be vitamin D and quercetin, which are 2 of the supplements I'll also be speaking about today. So first, let's start with vitamin D and COVID-19. Why would we think vitamin D plays a role in the development of this disease? Here's some of the evidence that the medical community has noted. The COVID-19 outbreak occurred in the winter when people have the lowest vitamin D concentrations in their blood. Case fatality rates have increased with age and chronic disease comorbidities, such as obesity and hypertension, which are 2 states that are both associated with lower vitamin D concentration. We know that vitamin D deficiency contributes to ARDS, susceptibility to respiratory infections, ICU admissions, and mortality. And vitamin D deficiency is also related to cancer-related morbidity. And vitamin D deficiency is common in the U.S., but especially among Hispanic and Black populations, which are two of the populations overrepresented among U.S. COVID-19 cases to date. We know that vitamin D strengthens innate immunity and prevents overactive immune responses. And we've also found through observational studies that rates of infection are higher in countries at higher latitudes, which get less sunlight and have populations with lower vitamin D levels. So how might vitamin D reduce the risk of COVID-19? First of all, vitamin D helps reduce survival and replication of viruses by inducing secretion of antimicrobial peptides called cathelicidins and defensins from immune-fighting cells like white blood cells and macrophages. Second, vitamin D can modulate the innate and adaptive immune system. Vitamin D receptors are on key immune cells like T and B lymphocytes, where vitamin D can influence these cells, and these immune cells can actually also synthesize their own active vitamin D metabolite. And third, in cytokine storm, as I mentioned earlier, the innate immune system sends out cytokines and chemokines, which can be pro-inflammatory. So vitamin D actually reduces pro-inflammatory cytokine secretion and increases production of anti-inflammatory cytokines. It also decreases production of T helper 1 cells, which are involved in autoimmunity. And lastly, vitamin D increases ACE2 levels, which downregulates the renin-angiotensin pathway that's involved in multiple organ injury. And Dr. LaValley, my colleague, will describe this in more detail following this talk. However, ACE2 levels are known to be high in children, which could be the reason that children are more protected from COVID-19, even though ACE2 is also the receptor for the SARS-CoV virus to enter the cells. But we think that when the virus uses this ACE2 receptor to enter its cells, it can prevent the ACE2 enzyme from functioning properly. Therefore, higher levels could be protective. So vitamin D levels in COVID-19 risk have been studied in observational studies that have linked low vitamin D levels to a higher risk of infection. In a retrospective cohort study in the UK, average vitamin D levels were studied, as were number of COVID-19 cases and death rates across 20 European countries. The researchers of this study found that countries with low to average vitamin D levels in the population had higher numbers of COVID-19 cases and deaths, and the low vitamin D levels in the aging populations of Spain, Italy, and Switzerland, which were also the most vulnerable population for COVID-19. They found that severe COVID-19 infection would be estimated to develop in 17% of patients with vitamin D deficiency versus 14% in patients with healthy vitamin D levels. A study in the University of Chicago found that people likely to be deficient in vitamin D from prior history of being prescribed a vitamin D supplement were 77% more likely to test positive for coronavirus than those expected to be sufficient in vitamin D, and they concluded that vitamin D deficiency that's not sufficiently treated is associated with risk of COVID-19. And recently, a study in Israel evaluated people with vitamin D levels less than 30 nanograms per milliliter and found that those patients were 45% more likely to test positive for SARS-CoV-2, as well as 95% more likely to be hospitalized for the disease. And there was actually a greater clustering of positive test results for patients with levels less than 20 nanograms per milliliter. So this begs the question, what constitutes vitamin D deficiency and what levels are optimal or sufficient? Interestingly, there is no consensus standard for vitamin D levels among varying guidelines. So the answer to what vitamin D level is sufficient is complicated and varies depending on who you ask, basically. So the way you test your vitamin D levels is through a blood test. And I personally wanted to share an example about how complicated it can be to figure out if your levels are deficient, or sufficient, or insufficient. And my level happened to be 33.6 nanograms per milliliter. So according to the Endocrine Society, which is the guidelines that this particular lab used, I'm within range. But if you consult the Vitamin D Council, in this column over here, you can see that my levels would actually be considered insufficient according to their guidelines. So it's controversial whether levels above 30 are sufficient, or some other guidelines say levels above 40. So in determining whether or not we should be supplementing, it's, again, there's no consensus, and the answer is controversial. Several studies looked at vitamin D deficiency not only as a risk factor for developing COVID-19, but also for COVID-19 severity. And there are 3 observational studies that I wanted to bring your attention to. One of them was a UCLA retrospective case control study that looked at men and patients over 65, and they found that this population had an increased risk of inpatient admission. And they were also known to have a vitamin D deficiency, which was a risk factor for inpatient admission, but this was also confounded with increased age, because vitamin D levels decrease as age increases. So it's unclear whether vitamin D deficiency by itself or age was the risk factor. Another study in the UK performed a retrospective interim analysis and found a higher prevalence of vitamin D deficiency observed in patients requiring ICU admission, more than those managed on the medical wards. So in the ICU, they found that 19% of patients had vitamin D levels greater than 50 versus 39% of non-ICU patients. And a study at Northwestern University analyzed patient data from 10 countries and found a correlation between low vitamin D levels and hyperactive immune systems, which is important in playing a role in the cytokine storm and acute respiratory distress syndrome sequelae that I mentioned earlier. So just to recap, although recent epidemiologic studies suggest associations between low vitamin D concentrations and higher rates of COVID-19 infection and severity, these are likely related to ethnicity, age, and general health rather than a causal relationship. So to date, no clinical trials studying a potential effect of vitamin D supplementation on preventing COVID-19 disease have been completed, and the observational studies can only show associations and not causation. Speaking of clinical trials, there are 31 clinical trials worldwide investigating vitamin D in COVID-19 treatment or prevention, and 5 of these studies are active in the US at this time, and they are either looking at vitamin D treatment by itself for COVID-19 or in combination with other molecules such as hydroxychloroquine, vitamin C, and zinc in conjunction with vitamin D. So bottom line, according to the NIH's recommendation, there's insufficient data at this time to recommend for or against vitamin D in the prevention or treatment of COVID-19. But the rationale for using COVID-19 in treating this disease is that vitamin D immunomodulatory effects could potentially protect against infection or decrease the severity of illness. We have evidence of an association of low vitamin D levels and COVID severity from observational studies. And if you'd like to follow the latest information on clinicaltrials.gov, we'll be waiting for the results of these clinical trials with vitamin D use alone or in conjunction with other agents in people with COVID-19 to have the most conclusive evidence on its efficacy. In general, it's important to prevent vitamin D deficiency if your levels are low for your general health, especially your bone health and basic immunity. So you can talk to your doctor about checking your levels and how to manage them if they're low. And the policy implication is that benefits may outweigh risks. And even though vitamin D is generally affordable and safe, it's never without risk. And broadly recommending and implementing an unproven treatment is not likely cost effective. And finally, just to recap, adequate levels of vitamin D lie between over 30 to 40 nanograms per milliliter. The recommended daily allowance is 600 international units per day. And a physician may treat deficiency, a severe deficiency, with a treatment as up to as high as 50,000 IUs per week for about 8 weeks, and then can taper down to a maintenance level of 800 to 1,000 international units a day. But again, this would be under physician guidance. The best source of vitamin D is the sun, 15 to 30 minutes of direct sunlight exposure on skin, and of course, avoiding sunburn. And most adults over 19 years old can get 400 to 1,000 international vitamin D daily from food and supplements, as well as from sunlight. So you don't necessarily have to take a supplement to make sure your vitamin D levels are up to par. So this moves us on to vitamin C. So why look at vitamin C and infections and in COVID in general? So first, vitamin C is also known as ascorbic acid. It's necessary for proper immune function. Historically, a study found that USSR soldiers taking 300 milligrams daily vitamin C protected from influenza-associated pneumonia and was associated with shorter hospital stays. Today, we rationalize using vitamin C in patients with COVID-19 because of possible beneficial effects in severe and critical illness. We know that vitamin C works as an antioxidant, free radical scavenger, and as anti-inflammatory. It influences cellular immunity and vascular integrity. It has a potential, and there's a potential role for high-dose vitamin C in sepsis and ARDS, which are sequelae of COVID-19, by reducing inflammation and improving vascular integrity. And in oxidative stress states, vitamin D actually gets sequestered in our cells, and our body may require more. For vitamin C, there have been 8 randomized clinical trials evaluating all-cause mortality in sepsis and ARDS. So this is sepsis and ARDS in general, not from COVID-19. But unfortunately, most of these randomized controlled trials, 6 of them, which total 635 patients, found no significant effect on vitamin C on mortality or improved survival. One of these studies was positive, which was a small free-arm study looking at only 24 critically ill sepsis patients, and they did find reductions in a 4-day study period of organ failure and pro-inflammatory markers with 200 milligrams per kilogram of vitamin C and 50 milligrams per kilogram of vitamin C versus placebo. But the landmark Citrus Ali trial, published in JAMA in October of last year, found that IV vitamin C did not improve disease severity scores or alter markers of inflammation or vascular injury, although it did find that vitamin C use was associated with a significantly lowered 28-day all-cause mortality and shorter ICU stays. And then more recently, the vitamin 3 trial found that the combination of vitamin C, IV vitamin C with hydrocortisone and thiamine did not improve the duration of shock, and there was no effect on mortality rate in the ICU versus using hydrocortisone alone. We'll be waiting for the results of clinical trials of vitamin C all over the world, and right now there are 7 going on in the US using vitamin C alone and in conjunction with other therapies. In China, however, it's been reported that high-dose IV vitamin C has improved lung function in COVID-19 patients, and this has been reported in media outlets touting shorter hospital stays versus untreated patients and no incidences of death. However, details of these studies are unavailable as findings are not published in preprint or peer-reviewed journals. And the caveat of high-dose vitamin C is that it's impossible to obtain the levels used in these studies using over-the-counter versions of oral vitamin C. There are adverse effects. You can get nausea, heartburn, and GI side effects that could be dose-limiting. And high doses of vitamin C are associated with kidney stones, especially in patients with high oxalate levels. So in summary, vitamin D is not currently a standard part of COVID-19 treatment plan because evidence is still lacking. High-dose IV vitamin C is currently being tested to see if it can improve lung function in COVID-19 patients, and no evidence to date suggests high doses of oral vitamin C supplements can help with this disease. And on the contrary, adverse events can occur, such as diarrhea. The third supplement I want to get to is quercetin, which is a plant flavonoid in capers, green tea, and other vegetables. And this is suggested as a key mediator in the Mediterranean diet and has been known to have antiviral properties which were investigated in numerous studies. It's consumed as a supplement, and it can be co-administered with vitamin C or D because vitamin C and D can help recycle quercetin, increasing its efficacy. Quercetin can be potentially help with COVID-19 treatment based on the study with the study I alluded to earlier, where the researchers did the gene mapping with COVID-19 and the ACE2 entry into the cells, and the quercetin can bind the C3L protease that the virus uses for replication and entry into cells. So this is an in vitro computerized example of how quercetin could potentially be effective for treating COVID. But what do the studies show? So quercetin has been studied in mice and men and women. And first, in vitro, we found that it alters expression of 30% of human genes encoding protein targets of SARS-CoV-2, potentially interfering with functions of 85% of viral proteins of human cells. And there have been studies using quercetin in mice, and most interestingly, in 2016, Rodents administered quercetin before exposure to lethal doses of Ebola virus had survived, and athletes have actually been supplemented with quercetin, which has been found to protect them from stress-induced susceptibility to upper respiratory infections. Right now, there are 2 clinical trials ongoing globally that are evaluating quercetin in prophylactic and treating against COVID-19. But the very oral bioavailability of quercetin is questionable. Some physicians say that it doesn't get, there's low bioavailability in the body, which means that it can't be effective when taken orally. However, it's known to be pretty safe. There's been no significant adverse events in patients who have been taking quercetin and studied. The advantages are it's available over the counter and has a good safety profile, and it's cheap. The disadvantages are that it lacks potency in some in vitro experiments and has a short half-life. And finally, I just wanted to talk about zinc as the 4th supplement, which is getting a lot of press in treating COVID-19. Zinc is a trace mineral thought to inhibit viral replication and attaches to the nasopharyngeal mucus, so it's implicated in managing the common cold. There's been a lot of in vitro studies studying zinc and modifying respiratory pathogens, but the clinical trials have shown conflicting results and methodological flaws, but it's known that zinc can reduce the common cold duration by 1.65 days. And as far as zinc and treating patients with COVID-19 goes, there's no results of studies evaluating zinc to treat COVID-19 at this time, although a New York physician claims near-perfect clinical responses to his prescription of hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin, and zinc, but there's no published data to support this. Oral zinc has been found to be safe up to 40 milligrams per day in adults. Its safety is less certain in greater doses that are implicated in managing viruses, and there are adverse effects that can occur, such as nausea, vomiting, and change in taste. 18 total registered clinical trials are ongoing worldwide. 10 are actively recruiting, 1 has been completed, and 4 are recruiting and enrolling by invitation in the US at this time. So putting it all together, some physicians are applying this MAP Plus protocol to treat COVID-19. However, they're not undergoing randomized controlled clinical trials, and they're claiming that there's no time to double blind anything. So they're treating patients with vitamin C, thiamine, heparin, a steroid, vitamin D, zinc, and melatonin. And they're pushing back on the necessity of and feasibility of randomized clinical trials, saying there's no equipoise, which is the principle that requires a clinical trial should only be, it's the principle that says the clinical trial should only be performed if there's a genuine uncertainty about which treatment is beneficial. And then critics of this protocol say, we need to separate noise from the evidence. We need to make sure that we're doing this under a controlled setting where we can prove efficacy. So in summary, the use of micronutrient supplements, including vitamin C, D, zinc, and quercetin, to prevent or aid in treating COVID-19 remains unsubstantiated. Clinical trials, however, are ongoing, and the results of these will be integral in helping us further our recommendations. In the meantime, it is important to replete vitamin and nutrient deficiencies using supplementation guidelines under the guidance of your physician if you are low or lacking in certain minerals and vitamins. And lifestyle is plays a really important role, because if you eat well and you have a diet of greater than or equal to 5 servings of fruits and vegetables per day, you can get enough vitamin C, D, and zinc from citrus fruits, especially and fish, especially for vitamin D and zinc. Sunlight exposure increases your blood levels of vitamin D to the same extent as an oral dose of 250 to 620 micrograms. And if you manage your risk factors like hypertension, diabetes, and obesity, this is also important in minimizing complications from COVID-19. If you'd like to learn more, these are the resources that I've referenced in the study and that you can consult on your own. And at this time, I will take any questions. Thank you so much. If If you have questions, you can type them into the question and answer tab in the Zoom box, and I will see them and read them aloud. No questions so far, but feel free to ask if it's a personal question or something. Oh, okay. What about vitamin D as an acute phase reactant? How could low vitamin D levels in COVID-19 patients simply be because they are sick? Absolutely. Like I said, we don't have any evidence from randomized clinical trials yet that vitamin D deficiency is the causality for COVID-19 severity. We know that vitamin D levels are lower in patients as they age and in comorbidities. So this could just be an association that these patients are sick from other comorbidities and their vitamin D levels are low by association and not having a causal relation. Given the billions spent on vaccines, et cetera, what do you think about the level of U.S. investments, engagements with these therapies? Big and small, is there a growing interest? This is controversial. I would say that, what do I think about the level of U.S. investment engagement with these therapies? Actually, as you can see in the clinical trials, clinicaltrials.gov slides that I showed, there actually is U.S. interest in evaluating these supplements in treating and preventing COVID-19, and the randomized clinical trials that are ongoing are a testament to that. So, we'll wait and see what those results show. There's nothing conclusive yet that shows that this is the end-all, be-all. So, again, the evidence is not that strong yet. So I think once we have a clinical trial that shows efficacy, then we'll, if people, that would be more of a benchmark for how much investment should be going into these trials. What are the implications for patients currently under treatment for cancer with reduced immune function? Patients under treatment for cancer with reduced immune function are presumably at higher risk for developing COVID-19. There are some recommendations for higher vitamin D baseline levels in patients with cancer and other comorbidities. But again, because the guidelines vary, this is controversial and something that could be of interest to talk to your oncologist about if you or someone is undergoing a therapy for cancer. And finally, could liposomal vitamin C formulations overcome the limitations you noted of over-the-counter products? I don't think it's necessarily liposomal vitamin C overcome the limitations. So vitamin C is water soluble, and liposomal vitamin C, for those who don't know, makes it fat soluble, so easier to pass into cells. And this is a good question. I'd be interested to see if there's any research looking at this. I personally don't have the answer, but it's a great, in theory, it's a great idea, and I would have to look into this to see if there's been any studies to see how this affects levels in the body. And I think we have time for one more. How often should I have my vitamin D level checked? Whether or not you should even be checking your vitamin D level is controversial in and of itself. It's something you can talk to your doctor about. I personally had my levels checked because I was curious to see what my range was. And again, in medicine, you only check something if it changes the management. And if we don't have effective guidelines on different management of how to manage different levels, it's really hard to say what you should do. So my level, for example, was 33. Do I supplement or not? So again, it's a controversial question whether or not you should have them checked at all, and something you should definitely talk to your doctor about. And I think we have time for one more question. And should I use daily doses of vitamin D and C as a prophylactic? And does a multivitamin have enough of these? Again, you should talk to your doctor about whether or not your levels are sufficient I think in general, again, it's unclear the effect of vitamin D and vitamin C in preventing and treating COVID because we don't have results of randomized clinical trials yet. So this is more of a personal decision where I can't really offer recommendation in general. And does a multivitamin have enough of these? Again, it depends which supplement, and that's really company dependent. So it's 12:31. This concludes our question and answer session, and I'm going to switch over now to my colleague, Dr. LaValley, for his portion of today's webinar. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Berman. I'm happy to introduce Dr. LaValley for part 2, Molecular Targets for Natural Product Supplements in COVID-19, Practical Clinical Choices Targeting Viral Replication, Inflammatory Cytokine Storm, and Coagulopathy. Dr. LaValley has been a licensed physician in Austin, Texas, and Nova Scotia, Canada since 1988, and he graduated from Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas in 1986. His clinical expertise includes treating patients with chronic complex multi-system disease with evidence-based, molecularly targeted, integrative, and complementary medicine. Dr. LaValley provides molecular integrative oncology professional consultations for patients and their families in professional medical collaboration with their licensed physicians in the US, Canada, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and Middle East. He was appointed by Canada's Minister of Health to the Expert Advisory Committee of the Natural Health Products Directorate for the development of regulations for natural health products in Canada from 2000 to 2004. Since 1994, he has chaired the Integrative and Complementary Medicine section in Doctors Nova Scotia, the Nova Scotia division of the Canadian Medical Association. So please join me in welcoming Dr. William LaValley.
Thank you, Maureen. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming to this webinar. There's a lot of information and want to move along quickly. As we begin, I remember being frustrated by professors whizzing quickly through material, not being able to keep up to make good notes. So because we're recording the video and you can get the video and then you can freeze frame the information, you don't have to take any notes. It'll all be there. It's available for you. So I encourage you to follow along and be free of the requirement to take notes. You can always go back and get the information. So SARS-CoV-2, the virus, and COVID-19, the disease, there's a lot of people with a lot of different options that are being made available. And what I'm doing with this conference, this webinar, is presenting a framework so you can make more clear clinical choices and personal choices. Oftentimes people who are practitioners, whether it's medical doctors or doctors of osteopathy or naturopathic doctors or licensed acupuncturists or traditional Chinese medicine, there's a lot of inquiries that people say, well, what should we do? What should we do? Should we do this? I want to make a framework, give you understanding and information that you can make decisions based on this, rather than tell you here's a list of things to do, because every clinical situation requires personalization, and this will give you the ability, hopefully, to be able to ask and answer those questions. So we're going to look at three things in general: the renin-angiotensin system and its response in COVID-19, the viral cycle entry and life cycle replication, and targeting multiple molecular vulnerabilities in that life cycle. Then look at the immune cytokine response, often referred to as cytokine storm, but it's a spectrum, and you can have no cytokine release. Those are the asymptomatic people, mild, moderate, or the severe, which is a cytokine storm, and coagulopathy. And some characterizations are evolving regarding COVID-19 that it's a cardiovascular disease as much as a respiratory disease because of the attack, the inflammation and coagulopathy that occurs throughout the body, not just the respiratory system. So here we go. It's going to be fast-paced, and I'm providing only natural product information because there are a whole range of other pharmaceutical options, including on-label and repurposed pharmaceuticals, but that's not included for today's presentation. So the emphasis on natural products in no way excludes the relevance of available pharmaceuticals, either over the counter or repurposed. Primarily, I think there's the emphasis on repurposed pharmaceuticals. At the end, we'll have time for questions. And if there are, and when the question time is over, if any have any additional questions, please feel encouraged to contact me. Renin-angiotensin system. Why is it important? Well, renin changes angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is modified by angiotensin converting enzyme ACE to angiotensin 2, referred to as Ang2. In addition, angiotensin 1 is modified by the famous ACE2 receptor, and that's where we're going to put focus because the COVID virus attaches to the ACE2 receptor. Most likely you're already familiar with that. The angiotensin 1,9 is converted also by ACE, this time to another angiotensin called 1,7. And 1,7, angiotensin 1,7 is often referred to as Ang1,7. Interestingly, ACE2 takes Ang2 to Ang1,7. Back at angiotensin 2, angiotensin 2 is modified into an activating angiotensin 2 activates angiotensin 2 receptor type 1 receptors, are called AT1 receptors. So those are the bad guy downstream effects. AT1 receptors, vasoconstriction, fibrosis, inflammation, thrombosis, pulmonary damage. We see this in COVID-19. And there are blockers of angiotensin 2 receptor type 1, AT1 blockers called ARBs. And physicians are already prescribing them. They're famous direct AT1 blockers. And these are the drugs that end in the suffix sartan, losartan, telmisartan, and so on. Importantly, they inhibit, downregulate, and decrease this activity, these molecular effects. And angiotensin 2, Ang2 doesn't only have adverse downstream effects, it also affects other receptors, the angiotensin 2 receptor type 2. So the angiotensin 2 receptors are type 1 and type 2. So AT1 and AT2. It's important. Importantly, also angiotensin 1,7, so Ang1,7 and Ang2 can have effects on AT2. And importantly, AT2 receptors activate the good guy stream of activity. Vasodilation, decreased fibrosis, decreased inflammation, decreased thrombosis, decreased pulmonary damage, edema, and permeability. So think of these two as opposing one another. Also, downstream of Ang1,7 are the MAS receptors, which activate the same activities as AT2 receptors. So this, this understanding of the renin-angiotensin system downstream of ACE2 activation is activating the good anti-inflammatory, anti-fibrotic activity and counteracts or balances the bad activity of fibrosis, inflammation, and thrombosis. So think of this as a counteracting. Upstream in the ACE inhibitors, not only inhibit from angiotensin 1 to Ang2, but also the angiotensin 1,9 to 1,7. So there's some additional considerations to be had here. I'll show you why the ACE inhibitors may be of benefit. Importantly, these drugs, the ARBs, help to funnel or direct the Ang2 activity downstream to the AT2 activity. The ACE inhibitors are those drugs ending in pril, the suffix pril, benazepril, captopril, enalapril, and so forth. So in the emphasis, here's the molecular emphasis. We want to upregulate this. We want to upregulate ACE2 pathways down through and downstream of that in the Ang17 to activate this. Because if you think of them as a balance, counterweight, the low ACE2 and increased Ang2 leads to that bad effects, where the decreased Ang2 and increased ACE2 gives better organ protection or decreased inflammation, thrombosis, and fibrosis. So you've seen now enough to see that in the angiotensinogen to Ang1 converted to Ang2 downstream is the AT1 receptor downstream activity, which is undesirable disease in COVID-19. The Ang2 gets converted by ACE2 to Ang17 downstream with good, desirable anti-inflammatory. So you see the balance of those. Now, interestingly, the ARBs, we already know, have the AT1 inhibition. There's data supporting activating ACE2 activity, which is desirable. And the ACE inhibitors, interestingly, as well, have some data supporting the activation of ACE2, not just the inhibition of ACE, or it's also called ACE1. So how does the SARS-CoV-2 virus affect? Well, it's because it's binding to the ACE2 receptor, is taking it out of that pathway activity, taking it out of the activation of Ang17. It does upregulate, therefore, the Ang2 effects. So let's look at these quickly and get an idea of the activity of the virus in the cells. So there's ACE2 receptor. There's another important receptor, TMPRSS2. TMPRSS2. There's ACE2. The virus is going to bind to it, and it binds through this red spike glycoprotein. And the spike glycoprotein is then primed by this TMPRSS2 for entry into the cell. Goes in the cell, that endocytosis becomes an endosome. The endosome releases its viral genome, and then that hijacks the cellular protein printer in the cell, the ribosome. And that produces these long polyproteins, which have this characteristic, a sinister characteristic. They're able to auto-cleave. That means they can break themselves apart, cut themselves apart. And the main protease that does that is called 3CL-Pro. And what it also has a name, MPRO or NSP5. Importantly, these polyproteins are broken down into non-structural proteins. These are the proteins, structural proteins around the capsule, and then some other accessory factors. And there are a relatively few amount of proteins within the COVID. One important is the RDRP, RNA-dependent RNA polymerase, which is active in producing the resulting components for reproducing the genome and transcribing components, as well as then helping to produce the proteins to translate the viral structure. So essentially make proteins that make more of the virus. Here, the virus proteins, those structural proteins, now are in the endoplasmic reticulum. They move to encapsulate this protected genome, and that invaginates around, goes through the Golgi body into small vesicles that then is released. So this sequence of events has multiple molecular vulnerabilities that have been researched through some of the natural product supplement literature. So that's the second component. What are we going to look at for interfering with molecular vulnerabilities in the viral life cycle? First, block spike glycoprotein. And there's significant options. There's a lot of data for looking at the following supplements, natural product supplements. Sometimes the data is in vitro, sometimes the data is in vivo, sometimes the data is in silico, meaning they've demonstrated through computer assessment of the size and shapes of the spike protein, as well as the size and shapes of the natural product molecules. Next target, block or inhibit TMPRSS2. And there are data for supporting these natural product supplements. Next target, activate, upregulate, or bind ACE2. So basically we want to activate the downstream good activities from ACE2, and we want to block it from being available to the SARS-CoV-2. So there are significant data for those natural products as well. Now, some of these natural products you may be familiar with, or may not be familiar with, but these are all already available on the retail market. And so that was the limitation in my research, was limiting it just to things that are available on the market, rather than there's a lot of other great data for natural products for all of these target, but those natural products are not available on the supplement market. Here is the main protease 3CL Pro. Inhibit 3CL Pro, stop it from being able to slice up these big polyproteins so that they are not able to go through this process to make these additional viruses, these natural product supplements. Next, inhibit RNA-dependent RNA polymerase, RDRP, and there are data for these natural products. So what do you do with this information? This is an array of information, of choices to consider. How do you make those choices? I've summarized those molecular vulnerabilities here for the actual interference with the SARS-CoV-2 replication cycle, the attachment, cellular entry, and replication, and then summarized in alphabetical order. There's no rank order here of importance, in alphabetical order of those natural products. In addition, what other evidence is there for using this group of natural anything in this group? What other evidence is there for how those can target the renin-angiotensin system, can target the coagulopathy, and can target the cytokine storm that occurs. So we're aiming at concurrent targeting of SARS-2, the actual viral activity, and the disease itself. So trying to make choices about overlapping options. In the infection, the development of clot, thrombus, we know that the Ang2, which is converted by the ACE2 enzyme, converts to Ang1,7 that releases NO, nitric oxide, and that's anti-coagulative. In other words, it vasodilates and suppresses platelet aggregation. When the virus attaches, we get increased coagulation activity and the release of response from the cells and cytokines. Here's a description of activity of the clotting cascades and cytokine activity. Presented it here for reference, for information. There's lots of data, lots of graphics available to look at this in many different variations. Importantly, the coagulopathy in COVID-19 is different than some of the other descriptions, some of the other diagnoses. In COVID-19, there's an increase in D-dimer, fibrinogen, activated complement and von Willebrand factor, antiphospholipid antibody, and inflammatory cytokines. And so these are targets, these are molecular vulnerabilities for therapeutic intervention. Summarize them: platelets, plasminogen activator inhibitor 1, fibrinogen, von Willebrand factor, D-dimer, factor 8, neutrophil extracellular traps, also called NETs, antiphospholipid antibody, and factor 7A. When you go to the literature, the PubMed literature, PubMed citation base, here's a heat map that looks at the factors that I've identified here in coagulopathy. And just from the list that's of the natural products that were identified, it's in that list there. Here's the heat map where a higher, bluer color is an indicator of 100 or more reference articles. So here's the heat map without the numbers. Here's the heat map with the numbers. And so left it there to guide your inquiries and guide your clinical choices, clinical decision-making process regarding concurrent targeting. So we're not only looking to inhibit the replication cycle, what are we doing for downstream, the other activities that are already occurring in these patients? And so how do we target multiple molecular vulnerabilities simultaneously? The cytokine storm, there's a lot of discussion and a lot of emphasis on the cytokine storm, the inflammatory molecules that are activated and released because of the response to multiple molecular cascades of activity from SARS-CoV-2 infection. And there's a large number of great graphics, a large number of important information available. Here's just one graphic and citation to give you an idea of what we're talking about. The molecules, the inflammatory molecules that are released in the cells, in the lung, and in the bloodstream, and in the serum. Here's another very good reference also that refers to the cytokine storm as well as coagulation. It's here for your reference. When you summarize the cytokines, I've summarized some 28 cytokines and inflammatory markers or inflammatory targets. Here's those same group of natural products and those cytokines with a heat map. The cytokine numbers, here's the heat maps easier visually, and here's the numbers. There's, for these molecules, for TNF alpha, IL-1 beta, IL-6, CCL2, which is, and IL-4, there's a significant amount of data for using natural products that already have anti-SARS-CoV-2 activity in the literature. And there's much more. These have been around a long time, and there's a lot of data for using these for their anti-inflammatory, anti-cytokine activity. Here's this longer list. And then extending the list because I couldn't fit them all on one page. These are for your reference, for guiding your clinical decision. So how do you know what to take? Well, the answer is I can't give any simple answer because everyone's different. Importantly, and with the emphasis on patients with cancer here, in addition, for the molecular integrative oncology, for whether it's a patient with SARS-CoV-2 or not, that this data, that each of the natural products in here has multi-targeted anti-cancer data in the in vivo and in vitro evidence-based literature. So the emphasis for selection is, so what can the patient tolerate? What kind of cancer do they have? What is the data for that natural product and that kind of cancer, and what is their cytokine profile likely? And you can start to make rational choices, rational options for your patients in clinic, as well as imagine for everyone, for personally and for their family and loved ones. So I'm available now for questions. Okay. Questions? Let's see. Is there a particular dose of quercetin that you would recommend? Oh, sorry, that wasn't. Laura says, can you give a case study example? Yes, although this is not in a patient who has cancer, but a patient who had significant confirmed COVID with serious respiratory compromise, but was told to stay out of the hospital. 65-year-old man who was told to stay out of the hospital. This was about 2.5 months ago, and was a friend and a patient, and who I administered a number of natural product supplements, probably 4 of them, and he had his illness for a month before contacting me, and his O2 saturation was down into the low 80s, couldn't walk up to the stairs. He was bedridden downstairs. Both he and his wife got infected, and he had gone into the emergency room multiple times. and so we started him on some natural products. And because he had other health concerns, I made some selections that were focused on some of the other health concerns as well. And within 1 week, he was back to, he was able to, his O2 sats were up in the mid 90s. He was able to go up and down the stairs. I think he's got some significant long-term sequelae, but it was a coincidental significant improvement. Of course, in a single case, you can't prove it, but that was one case study. Are there therapeutic amounts of some of the natural nutrients that we can get from food, such as onion, garlic family, herbs, and green tea, or do you feel they need to be supplemented? Great question. One of the great problems with natural product supplements is their low bioavailability, really decreased amounts compared to pharmaceuticals. There may be therapeutic amounts of antiviral activity in garlic in particular. Onion, I don't know. And green tea, probably if you drink a lot of green tea. And I think from a therapeutic point of view, supplementation gives much greater likelihood of therapeutic impact. I think I'm at 30 minutes, just went over a little bit. So thank you very much. Anyone that would like to contact or have any questions in the future, please do, as well as if there's any scientists or researchers or collaborators who may be interested in writing, authoring articles or doing clinical trial research in this, please be encouraged to contact me. I'm happy to talk to you. Thank you very much.
And this concludes our webinar for today. Thank you very much to both Dr. William LaValley and Dr. Tara Berman for being with us today, and everyone have a wonderful afternoon.